this whole show, the Hidden Truth Show, started with a really big deep dive on the Las Vegas shooting. So we still have a lot of our following is people that loved that deep dive and still follow the Las Vegas shooting. For the most part, it's been wrapped up. For a lot of people, there's still lingering questions about whether this guy truly acted alone, et cetera. But there's also some gun issues that, of course, arise from the Las Vegas shooting. So why don't we start with just getting your thoughts about that shooting and, the fact that bump stock was involved and the fact that he was able to, put together such a huge arsenal, et cetera.
Sure. Well, I mean, he didn't really use the huge arsenal that he had. I mean, I'm still not 100% sure how many guns he used, but if it was one or two guns, the fact that he had a lot more guns didn't really seem to affect the outcome that was there. As far as the bump stock goes, obviously that allowed him to fire faster than he would have been able to probably fire otherwise. But there's lots of ways that he could have produced a very similar result, simply with a belt loop or whatever. You just need something that kind of is going to be stationary as the gun recoils and goes back and forth there. So, even if they had banned bump stocks, it's not really clear that the outcome would have been much different.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the thing with bump stocks or these other methods is it's hard to aim the gun. In this case, it really didn't matter too much because he was just firing into a large crowd of people that was there. It was a very unusual case. I assume that, I don't even know what motivated the guy yet to go and do it. There's lots of questions that we don't know from that attack. But in terms of how to stop it, that probably would have been about the most difficult one to go and stop that I know of. But the thing is, this guy apparently had lots of other methods to go and kill people. He had wired up his car with explosives. Apparently, the amount of explosives that he had in his car would have taken out a fairly large area, a good portion of a block. If he had driven that into the crowd that was there or near the crowd, a lot of people would have been harmed in that way. The guy seemed to have technical experience. Even if one kind of banned bump stocks, it seems pretty clear from the types of arrangements and things that the guy had made on his own. He would have been able to go and easily make a bump stock. A bump stock, in any case, is essentially two tubes, slightly different in size. One fits inside the other and a spring that's in it. So given the technical expertise that that guy showed, being able to go and put something like that together anyway would have seemed to have been a relatively trivial, effort on his part. So,
regarding bump stock, am I right that didn't Trump issue an executive order on bump stock, or ultimately was there a law on it?
He did have an executive order. He had talked about having a law, but the law that the Democrats insisted on would have covered essentially all semi-automatic guns potentially, and he wanted something more narrow. I mean, the vast majority of guns owned in the United States are semi-automatic guns. And he wanted something more narrow that would cover the bump stocks. And Democrats were unwilling to negotiate on that. And so he issued an executive order. It's been tied up in courts since then because it's not really clear that, in fact, it seems unlikely that he had the power to go and do that. But, it's been tied up and we're still waiting the outcomes of the court cases.
So as we speak today, your average person can go buy bump stock or not?
Well, the companies that were producing it have kind of shut down doing it. And, you risk potentially coming out on the wrong end if somehow Trump is successful in the court cases that he has.
So, as far as preventing the Vegas shooting, every situation is so unique, right? When it comes to how the person acquired their guns and who they were, and then
most of them aren't that unique. I mean, this was by far the most different case that I know of in terms of one of these mass public shootings. So, a large percentage of these people have bought the gun legitimately. Uh, it's pretty clear that these people are trying to commit suicide in a way that's going to go and get them media attention. These guys, I'm sure this guy was no different in the sense that he planned this well in advance. These killers, it's really amazing the amount of time and effort that they put into planning these attacks. 6 months is actually a fairly short window for the amount of planning that they put into these attacks. You take something like the Sandy Hook attack. The guy there was apparently planning the attack for 2.5 years prior to the attack. The police who had gone through and looked at what he had acquired, he had done a report for himself that many police described as essentially a doctoral dissertation, where he had looked at mass public shootings over the previous 40 years, had gone so far as to graph out the relationship between the number of people killed in an attack and the amount of media coverage that they got. Apparently, he had statements saying things like he wanted to go and kill more people than the Norway killer had killed, who had the most kills at that time. If you ignore the bombing deaths, he had 67 people that he had shot to death, which is more than the Las Vegas shooting. So anyway, those are often the common features. These people go to places where their victims aren't able to go and defend themselves, because their goal is to try to kill as many people as possible, because they believe that the more people they kill, the more media attention they're going to get. That's essentially why the Sandy Hook killer, for example, had graphed out that relationship.
Well, that's definitely my analysis of the Vegas shooter, that he didn't leave a note, but I think that the note was he wanted to be remembered as the most prolific mass shooter essentially in American history, partly outdoing his father, who was on the FBI's most wanted list, et cetera. But that really was the objective. His brother thinks that he was trying to seek retribution against the casinos that he had started losing large sums of money with. But we see from his Google searches that he was searching out other locations for the shooting: Fenway Park, downtown Chicago, the Santa Monica Pier. So that theory doesn't seem to hold water. Right? So my theory is he just wanted to kill as many people as possible. It's a murder suicide, which is a very common thing that you see.
Sure.
Is the murder suicide. This is mass murder suicide.
Right. Well, I mean, at some point, someplace in the past, because people have obviously wanted to commit suicide forever. Some people realized that when they wanted to commit suicide, they could do so in a way that other people would know that they were here and get news attention. You can't help but read the diaries or other statements that these killers leave behind. And they feel that they're unappreciated. They want to commit suicide, but they want people to know that they made an impact. And even some people go so far as to say, look, even if the media doesn't mention my name, I still might be able to be in the history books. And, it's really pathetic, but that's what it is. So.
So I've prepared for the interview as far as reading some of your positions. Haven't fully read any of your books, but to help us give some context as to what your view is, I'm curious because I know you've written a lot about the fact that guns themselves can result in the reduction in violence. Do you support guns in America primarily because of the Second Amendment right that Americans have that was given to us by our founders, or simply as a matter of policy? In other words, if there was no Second Amendment, nonetheless, you'd say that's the right policy, allow people to have guns.
Well, I never make Second Amendment arguments. I don't make it based on right. That's not what got me involved with this to begin with. I kind of accidentally got involved in the debate, but to me, it's just a question of safety. What types of things, what types of policies will save the most lives, will protect the most people? Anybody who's read my academic research knows that I think police are extremely important. I think police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And the question is, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And having a gun turns out to be by far the safest course of action for people to take when they're confronted by a criminal. And it's particularly true for two groups of people: people who are most likely victims of violent crime, that overwhelmingly tends to be poor Blacks who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a male criminal doing the attack. And when a man is attacking a woman, there's a larger strength difference that exists there on average than when a man's attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in a woman's ability to go and protect herself than it does for a man. So it's basically the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from being able to go and have a gun for protection.
What if you could hypothetically banish all guns? They don't exist. They don't exist on Earth.
Right.
Would you say that would be a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it'd be kind of hard to make sure that they disappear completely. Obviously, a lot of places have tried to ban guns, either all guns or all handguns. And one of the interesting things that you see there is every single time that either all guns or all handguns have been banned, murder rates go up. You'd think out of randomness, once or twice, murder rates would go down or at least stay the same. But in fact, every time they've gone up, and usually by very large amounts, and people will say, well, look, we've tried it in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, but those, they'll say, really weren't fair tests, because unless you ban guns every place, criminals can still get guns from Maryland or Virginia, or they can go and get them from the rest of Illinois or Indiana. The thing is, they could get those guns from those places to begin with. That may explain why the murder rate didn't go down as they were predicting, but it doesn't explain why you have these big increases in murder rates after guns are banned. And and you can look around the world. You have whole nations that have banned guns. You have island nations that have banned guns, where you don't have some neighbor to go and blame. And yet, each and every time, you see murder rates go up, usually by very large amounts. And there's seems to be a pretty simple explanation for that. And that is, when you go and you pass a regulation like a gun ban that primarily disarms law-abiding citizens and not criminals, you make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. You look at a country like Mexico, for example. Mexico, since 1972, has only had one gun store in the country. The most powerful gun you've been able to buy since 1972 legally is a 22 caliber short round rifle. In Mexico, in 2018, they only granted licenses to 3,182 people to go and legally own a gun. The license,
Basically, sorry, is it essentially like a hunting rifle?
any gun.
Right.
Or the most powerful gun is a 22 caliber rifle.
Gotcha.
And they do allow some people to have handguns and things like that, but they're basically 22 caliber handguns that you have. And it's you look at that, and yet Mexico has a murder rate that's about 6 times or so higher than the murder rate that we have in the United States. The point is that the drug gangs that are there bring in weapons from around the world, just as they go and they bring in the drugs that they bring into the United States. They're not getting these guns from the United States, despite a lot of claims to the contrary. You look at a recent 7-year period, the Mexican government had confiscated something like 13,000 hand grenades from drug gangs there. They're not buying hand grenades from gun stores in the United States. They're bringing them in from all around the world. And a lot of the guns that they steal are from the Mexican military that's there. And the same thing is true in the United States. The major source of illegal guns in the United States are drug dealers. I mean, it's not like a drug dealer can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole my drugs. Can you help us get them back? They have to essentially set up their own little militaries in order to protect that valuable property. If I could go and click my fingers and cause all guns in the United States to disappear, and let's say all illegal drugs, how long do you think it would be before illegal drugs started coming back into the United States? If you're in El Paso, Texas, 20 minutes. And how long before they'd go and bring in the weapons to protect that extremely valuable property that they'd have? They'd be bringing them in at the same time.
So walk me through Australia, because that's the one that people seem to point to as having successfully gotten rid of guns. So I presume you've done quite a bit of studying of Australia. Can you just kind of walk us through what was the program that they implemented to get rid of them, and how are they doing now?
Sure. Well, in 1996 and 97, Australia had a gun buyback there. They bought back something over a quarter of the guns that were legally owned in the country there and destroyed them. Guns weren't banned there, but they had a licensing system and stuff that they put in place, required that people have to have safes at home in order to go and lock up the guns that they have. The thing is, people went out and bought guns again afterwards. And by the time you get to about 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was actually higher than it was before the ban went into effect. Now, the thing is, what people often do when they make a comparison about Australia is they look at the before and after average, let's say firearm homicide rate or firearm suicide rate. And they'll say, look, the after average is about 50 or 60% lower than the before average. But it's really statistical malpractice that they're doing here. And the reason is that firearm homicide rates and firearm suicide rates were falling in almost a straight line for 15 years prior to the buyback that they had. And they continued to fall afterwards, but at a slower rate. Let's just take a simple example. Let's say it had been a perfectly straight line falling over the whole period of time. You could have picked any point along that line, and the after average is going to be below the before average. But if it's a perfectly straight line and you're looking at it, you're going to say, what impact did the buyback have on those types of instances that you're looking at? If it's a perfectly straight line, you'd say, well, it was falling, but it was falling before. There's no change. You think you'd want to look, is it falling at a faster rate or a slower rate, or is there some type of discontinuity that occurred there in the line in order to determine whether it had an impact? In fact, when you look at it, the rate that either of those were declining actually slowed down after the buyback occurred. And with regard to suicides, what you really want to look at is total suicides. And total suicides didn't fall. There was no relative change there that had occurred. Over time, before the buyback, people were switching into other ways of going and committing suicide. But there wasn't you have to, presumably you care not just about how people commit suicide, but the total number of suicides that are going on there. And so it's very misleading in terms of either of those two. And, you can compare Australia to New Zealand, which New Zealand didn't have any change in its gun laws at that same time. And, it had a similar pattern in terms of mass public shootings afterwards compared to what it was beforehand. I can look around the world. There's this claim often that the United States has a disproportionate number of mass public shootings, and that's simply false. It's actually the claim pretty much got started by a study by a professor at the University of Alabama who claimed that 31% of the world's mass public shooters were in the United States. Probably got more worldwide attention for that study than any other academic study done this century. Thing is, he wouldn't release his list of cases. Took almost 5 years before he was finally forced to release it. I had published an academic paper that kind of forced him to finally release his list of cases. And what you found is that he had made up his own definition of mass public shootings. He had looked at cases that only involved one shooter and had missed literally thousands of mass public shooting cases outside the United States that fit the definition that he claimed that he was using. And he had overcounted the cases in the United States. And that when you went through and actually used a data set that people at the University of Maryland had put together, what you found is that the United States only made up about 1% of the world's mass public shooters. And and we make about almost 5% of the world population. So we're way below the average. In many countries that have stricter gun control than Australia has, have had higher mass public shooting death rates or rates of attacks than the United States. France, for example, during the 8 years of the Obama presidency, just in 1 year, 2015, had more casualties from mass public shootings than the United States had during the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency. And a per capita rate, which is what you have to do to make comparisons across countries, what you find is that France, Finland, Norway, Russia, Switzerland, those are just major countries. You have lots of smaller countries like Serbia and what have you, have higher death rates from mass public shooting attacks than the United States. I mean, Europe, France basically bans semi-automatic guns. And yet they had the worst mass public shooting comparing just the United States and Europe. In November 2015, you had the concert hall shooting where 130 people were killed. And, you look at the Norway attack, they had the one attack, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah, well, these mass shootings, I think, say a lot more about the mental health issues than they do about gun issues for me. When you're talking about the true mass shootings, the Paddock type.
Well, obviously there, as we talked about before, and as you mentioned, there's this desire to commit suicide on these individuals' parts.
Yeah.
One can go and, I guess, define that as mental illness. And in fact, when you look at the data, what you find is that about half of these individuals have been seeing mental health care professionals within about 6 months or so of their attacks. One of the things that's interesting is how in not one single one of those attacks did those mental health care professionals identify those individuals as a danger to themselves or others. Even some of these cases, you're talking about world recognized experts in mental health that were looking at these people. The Santa Barbara killer, for example, he had been seeing several mental health care professionals. One at Children's Hospital in Los Angeles was considered a world recognized expert in terms of violence by young people. And yet he didn't identify the individual. One thing you find with these killers is they tend to be relatively smart. You read the diaries of the Santa Barbara killer, and he was being very gleeful about how he knew what they wanted him to say, and he would go and say what they wanted him to hear, and the mental health care professionals would basically just say, just take him at his word, whatever he was telling them.
So how do you feel about some type of health exam as a requirement to legally acquiring a gun?
Well, I mean, as we just said, if these mental health care professionals would have been able to identify some of these guys beforehand, that would have been nice. I don't think that that's going to be particularly helpful. I mean, if you want to go and give people more mental health care for general reasons, that's great. Go and do that. Okay. I'm sure we can go and have a public debate about how much we want to go and increase mental health care in the United States. But the notion that you're going to be able to go and identify these individuals beforehand as a danger to themselves. Look, you look at countries like France. France has a mental health care examination before you're able to go and get a gun. It takes about a year process to be able to go and get it. Germany has about the same process, takes about a year. Germany has much worse school shootings than we've had. 3 of the 6 worst mass public school shootings in the United States, or in the world, between the United States and Europe have taken place in Germany since 2000. And
well, maybe there would have been more, but for the health exam. I mean, that's one of the difficulties, right?
Yeah, but the thing you have to ask yourself also is, where are these attacks occurring? And I think one common feature, because the thing is, the issue is, what happens if we fail to identify these individuals? Okay. And the common feature that you see in about 94% of the mass public shootings in the United States, as well as all the mass public shootings in Europe, is that they take place in areas where guns are banned, where people aren't able to go and defend themselves. These guys may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. The successful ones, anyway. They go to places where they don't believe their victims are going to be able to defend themselves because they want to kill, as you mentioned earlier, as many people as possible. And if they go to a place where their victims are defenseless, they think they're going to be able to go and kill more people. You read the diaries or other things from people like the Aurora Batman movie theater shooter or others, and it's clear that they take into consideration whether or not somebody there with a gun might be able to stop them. You look at the Batman Aurora movie theater shooter. There were 7 movie theaters showing the Batman premiere within a 20-minute drive of the killer's apartment. Only one of those movie theaters banned permitted concealed handguns. That's the one he went to. You look at the Lafayette movie theater shooting in Louisiana, similar story. You look at the mall shootings in Omaha, Nebraska, or Kansas City, or Salt Lake City, or Portland, Oregon, similar types of stories. You have 8 enclosed malls in Omaha, Nebraska. Only one of them posted signs banning permitted concealed handguns. That's where the killer went. You see these same types of stories time after time.
Well, I think a good example of what you're saying as far as the deterrent effect is all of the looting that we've seen going on. And there was a lot of concern that the looting was going to extend beyond the stores into wealthy neighborhoods, particularly here in Los Angeles. I know people in Beverly Hills, the police there were on high alert and so on. And there was a lot of rumors going around that it was going to extend to the looting of homes. It didn't happen. And I think I would posit, and you probably would too, that the primary reason is they know that a lot of these homeowners have guns.
Right. I mean, well, there's lots of comparisons you can make across countries. For example, we have data on what's called hot burglary rates. These are burglaries that occur while the residents are in the dwelling. Just make a comparison between the United States and the UK, for example. The UK has a burglary rate about twice the burglary rate in the United States. And 60% of the time that burglaries occur in the UK, they occur while the residents are at home. In the United States, only about 13% of burglaries occur while the residents are in the home. Why is that? Well, they've done surveys. The RAND Corporation has done a survey. Others have done surveys. And what they find is that burglars in the United States spend about twice as long casing a home compared to their British counterparts. And when asked, why do you spend so much time casing homes in the United States? The explanation that they give is that they're worried about being shot, which kind of fits your point that was there. In the UK, that's not their concern. They're not worried about what the homeowner is going to be able to do to them, so they don't really care whether the homeowners are there when they go and break in, and so they don't spend the time going and trying to figure out whether somebody might be there before they go and break into the home.
So here's a type of shooting that I've been really focused on lately and really curious to get your take on, and that's police shootings.
Right.
And it appears this is nowhere close to my expertise. So this is just me casually reading like anyone else has as a result of George Floyd, and although that wasn't a shooting, but the various shootings and so on, is that in the U.S. there's per year, and it's been a pretty consistent number over the last 10 years, 1,000 people have died at the hands of a police shooting in the US. That means every day, for all the stuff we hear about in the news about these particular cases, every day, apparently, there's 3 people being shot dead by police in America. And when you compare those statistics to other countries, they far surpass other countries. I mean, I think the closest may have been Canada, and we're like 10 times more than Canada. I mean, significant difference in America versus other countries' police shootings. What do you make of that?
Well, a couple things to make of it. We have a drug gang problem in the United States. And, you have over half the murders in the United States take place in 2% of the counties. And if you ever see a murder map for those 2% of the counties, you're going to find about 2/3 of their murders take place within 10-block areas within those 2% of the counties. So murders in the United States are very heavily concentrated in relatively tiny areas. And a lot of the police shootings are taking place in those areas. One comment, because we've looked very closely at police shootings. We've put together a data set where we've identified many characteristics. Was the person armed or not? Were they involved in a commission of a crime? What type of crime were they involved with? We also have information, where the police were wearing body cameras. We know the race of the officer. We know the race of the person who was shot. What you find is that overwhelmingly, the people who are shot were armed. Okay, you're talking about almost 90% of these cases. A lot of the rest of them were actually involved in the commission of a violent crime at the point when they were shot. I think the media is largely responsible for the violence that we're seeing right now in these cities, because they've really given people a misimpression of police shootings. So let me give you an example on this. When you look at white officers shooting black suspects, that rate is actually slightly lower than the rate that black officers shoot black suspects. But when you look at the individual cases in the news coverage, people would have no way of knowing that, because 38% of the time when a white officer shoots a black suspect, it gets national news coverage, where the race of the officer and the race of the suspect is mentioned in the news article. When a black officer shoots a black suspect, only 6% of those news stories mention the race of the officer and the race of the suspect. When a black officer shoots a white suspect, 0% of the news stories, national news stories, or there's zero national news stories on those cases. And it really, whatever the motivation is for why they decide which cases to go and give news coverage to, it really gives people a misimpression. I can't blame people who really believe that there's a systemic problem with white officers shooting black suspects when, the media, by a huge ratio of 38-6, covers, the race of the white officers shooting black suspects and pretty much ignores the vast majority of stories when a black officer shoots a black or a black officer shoots a white.
Yeah, that's really fascinating numbers, and I've been making the point again and again about police brutality. I'm certainly willing to go there, that there's a police brutality issue that needs to be addressed to some extent. But the whole idea that this,
case,
pardon me?
the Minneapolis case, the officer obviously was at fault. He did something wrong. The other officer should have stopped him. There's no problem with that. And the thing is, though, the media treats cases like Atlanta or Kenosha or other places as the same, and they're not the same. So in Atlanta, which kind of was the next shooting right after the Minneapolis case, you had this Brooks guy who had kind of passed out because he was inebriated in a drive-through fast food restaurant line at a Wendy's burger place. The police had come there. This guy was much bigger than either of the police officers. He was easily more than a foot taller than either of the police officers. He must have weighed at least 70 pounds or so more than either of the police officers. He was obviously inebriated. The police, textbook case of being extremely courteous to him, went through the sobriety tests that was there. The guy was obviously failing it, but they did nothing wrong. And then he attacked them. Because of his much bigger size, he was able to go and grab the taser from one of the officers that was there. He fired it once, was going to fire it again at another officer when the officer shot him. Uh, it's hard to think of any training by any police in the country that would have had those officers behave differently than they actually did behave in that situation. But the officer who shot him was fired from the Atlanta Police Department. And then he's been charged with felony murder. And if he was convicted, which I severely doubt that he will, he would face the death penalty in Georgia. But they rarely show much of the video from that. It's a narrative there that just implies that you had a white officer shooting a black. That's something systemic that's going on there. The Kenosha case is similar, and we could go through many of the other cases that are there.
They all involve an individual either fighting back against police or not doing what police ask them to do. So
right.
People should know that you put your life in your own hands, and I don't care what race you are, you put your life in your own hands when you start disobeying police orders and attacking police and not following instruction.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, we have this narrative where the saying is that blacks have this talk with their kids about how to behave with police, but that's somehow unique. But my kids, I tell them, if a police officer gives you orders, if he tells you to get on the ground or do something else, you do what the officer says. It's not something that only blacks give their kids advice on how to behave. It's something that you have to learn how to go and deal with a police officer. The police officer tells you to keep your hands on the steering wheel when he's there. That's what you do.
Yeah. Well, it's common sense. And unfortunately, in the black community, we have a distinct absence of black fathers in the home to teach their children these things. So I was taught the same thing by my father. I don't have children, but I will teach them the same thing that you're teaching your children. Of course, that's an important thing for parents. I mean, it's kind of common sense and obvious, but as you point out, every parent should be teaching their child that. And it's children who have parents in the home and good parents around to teach them that who are going to know it. Others.
Well, I think partly what's happened is in part because of the news coverage, like I was just talking about, what types of cases get national news coverage, and who knows what's going through the reporters' minds for why they think it's more of a news story when a white officer shoots a black suspect than a black officer shooting a black suspect. But for whatever the reason, it creates this narrative, and people get angry about that. And so you have people who may feel that an officer, even when he's not racist, might be racist simply because he's going and dealing with the black at that situation. And so I think it's caused problems in many ways, the type of national coverage that we get on these issues.
Yeah, the presumption that simply because it was a white shooting a black that it was racist is a very dangerous presumption, but that's the presumption that exists in America, and it seems like people are buying into it, even though we have zero evidence that these incidents we've been talking about were based on race. Which
well, we
leads
don't
me
even
to
know, we don't even know if the Minneapolis case was racist.
Correct.
We know the officer behaved improperly. We know that he did something that was wrong, but why he did it.
And they probably knew each other. I don't know if that was ever sussed out.
Know each other. They had worked at the same place for a while, so apparently they did know each other. But there's no evidence that I've seen presented by anybody that this officer was racist. He was just
but we're all supposed to just assume it. Which leads to a question: since you've been, I didn't realize you've been doing this deep study into police shootings. So, if race was a motivation in one of these shootings, I would imagine that would ratchet it up as far as the crime, a hate crime, etc. So, if the police officer was motivated by racism, I don't know this for sure, but I would think that could change the sentencing guidelines. In your studies, are you aware of any police shooting cases where it was affirmatively determined that yes, race was the reason behind the shooting?
Not in the years that we've looked at. I assume in the past there may have been cases like that. I have no problem believing that that's the case, but I think you'd be really hard pressed to provide any evidence that this is systemic in any way, or even that it's something that you can measure.
So what about, though, you pointed this out, that I think you said 90% of the shootings involved the victim having a gun, or maybe they thought that
Well,
he had
armed, they could have a knife or something like that.
being armed. So one thought that I've had in trying to understand and explain, why we could have so many more shootings here in the US is that in the US there are so many guns that police are more in fear that the person, either they know they have a gun or they think that they could have a gun, compared to other countries. So is that a fair possible explanation for us having more shootings, is that we have so many guns that police here are just simply in more fear for their own lives?
No, I don't think so. I think, again, you have to go and look to see where a lot of these police shootings are, and they tend to be in these areas where there's a lot of violence occurring to begin with. And that's basically areas where you have a lot of gang violence that's there. These police, look, the United States has a worse drug gang problem than a lot of countries do. And there's reasons why we can go and talk about that. But, you have to ask why we have a worse drug gang problems. But in those areas, police, when they're dealing with drug gangs or they're dealing with the fallout from them, are facing risky situations and they fire. But I'll give you one example just to kind of deal directly with your point, and that is, um, uh, in many states, when a police officer pulls over a car for somebody who has a concealed handgun permit, when they put in the license plate into their computer, it will come up whether the person has a concealed handgun permit. And what you find if you talk to police is that they're relieved to know that the person has a concealed handgun permit because they know how law abiding those individuals are. Those people lose their permits for any firearms related violation at thousands or tens of thousands of one percentage point, and usually for very trivial reasons. And so, you look at this and, it's not the guns per se, it's who has the guns that they're concerned about, and people who are engaged in violence when the police officer comes upon the person. The police aren't just shooting people who are just walking down the street because they think that these guys might have a gun. What's happened is they come upon a person who's involved in a crime, and or is running from a crime. And when they're trying to stop that individual, the individual brandishes a weapon. And that's overwhelmingly the types of cases where you have shootings occur. You look at these cases, and overwhelmingly, these police shootings were justified.
You do have situations where they thought he was reaching for a gun and it turned out he wasn't reaching
I
for a
didn't say
gun.
always. I just said overwhelmingly. I
Yeah.
agree with you. So,
So,
but the
well, sorry, I was going to use that just to lead to a question, which is the rules of engagement for police in the U.S. I think they're more liberal toward police in the U.S. than other countries. I don't know that for sure, but this idea that if he has a reasonable fear, you're basically free to shoot to kill, and it seems that the police are trained essentially to shoot to kill. They don't aim for the leg. So do you have any problems with the rules of engagement that US police tend to follow?
No, I mean, the thing that's bizarre that we have right now is in this defund the police movement. One of the parts of it is they want to take away non-lethal methods that police have to go and deal with criminals, which is why do they think these non-lethal methods got developed to begin with? The reason why the non-lethal methods got developed to begin with was to make it so that the police didn't have to shoot somebody like that. But of course, you're not going to aim for a leg or something. It's much harder to go and hit that, particularly if it's moving. You're trained to go and hit the person center mass, where you're more likely to hit him and not have the bullet go flying away and maybe hit somebody else down the street that's there. This movement that we see to get rid of non-lethal methods, from anything from tear gas to pepper spray to pepper balls or other types of things, has multiple impacts. You look at riots. Well, what does that do? It makes it much harder for police to engage in people in riots. If they do have to engage, they're going to be more likely to involve lethal force. But it also means that the police, as I say, aren't going to engage. And that makes it so that the riots are more likely to be out of control than they would have been otherwise.
So the NRA gets criticized for never seeming to support any restriction on guns. It's the camel's nose under the tent or what have you. Where are you on common sense gun laws? Is there any common sense gun laws that you support?
To me, it's a question of what works. But the thing that's interesting to me is what gun control advocates insist on. I'll give you an example. Everybody wants to stop criminals from getting guns. Okay, background checks make sense. But the current background check system we have is a complete mess, and gun control advocates refuse to fix it in any way. So, for example, one of the claims that you frequently see is the claim that there are 3 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. That's simply false. What they should say is there have been 3.5 million initial denials, and something over 99% of those were mistakes. It's one thing to stop a felon from buying a gun. It's another thing to stop somebody simply because they have a similar name to a felon from buying a gun. And the problem is that the people who get stopped are overwhelmingly law-abiding, good Black males and Hispanic males who simply have a name similar to somebody that the government wants to stop. And there's no reason why we should be having these mistakes. When you go and you buy a gun, you fill out something called a 4473. You put down your name, your social security number, your address, your birthday, your race, your eye color, and you think the government's using all that information. What they end up using is roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays. And you get a lot of mistakes. You know, I don't know if you own a company or you know people who do, but if they do criminal background checks on employees, go and suggest to them that they look at roughly phonetically similar names when they do the background checks on their employees. They're going to look at you like you're from Mars, because they know that there's going to be lots of mistakes if they go and do background checks like that. If private companies, when they do background checks, had an error rate that was 100th the error rate that the federal government has in doing background checks, under federal law, those companies would be sued out of existence. There's a simple fix. Simply require that the federal government has to do background checks in the same way that the federal government mandates that private companies have to do background checks, which is basically just require that they use all the information that they have and use it exactly as it is. But, you know, right now, if you have two people, first of all, they don't even look at middle names. But let's say you have one person whose last name is Smith with an I, and another person whose last name is Smith with a Y and an E. As far as the background check system is concerned, that's the same person.
How long has this been going on for? I've never heard of this.
This has been going on for decades. I had an article a couple of years ago in the New York Times where I went through examples of all the problems that were with the background check system, giving examples of these mistakes that are being made all the time. Now, you can appeal the mistakes, but the problem is the vast majority of people who go and appeal have to go and hire a lawyer, and you're talking about at least $3,000 to go and do it. And so people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other Blacks. 33% of Black males in the United States are legally prohibited from owning a gun because of past felony records. Whose names are their names most likely to be confused with? Other law-abiding, good Black males who want to go and get a gun to protect themselves and their families. It's very racist the way this system is set up. But if you go and talk to Democrats or gun control advocates, they will fight you tooth and nail against fixing that. When the Fix NICS bill came up a couple years ago, I was working with Senate staffers to try to put an amendment together that would fix this, essentially just the simple thing, requiring the federal government has to do background checks in the same way that the federal government mandates that private companies do. Democrats claimed it was a poison pill, and they would blame Republicans then for killing the Fix NICS bill if they insisted on having that amendment that was there. Now, that's not the only problem with this. There's a cost. When you go and you buy a new gun, there's a cost to the background check, but you don't see it because it's in the price of the gun. It's not like a sales tax that they go and add on top of a gun. You look in Washington, D.C., it's $125 per gun to go and transfer a gun. In New York City, there's one gun store that will do it for 125. Others will do it for like 175 or 200. You can find some places like Oregon where it's as low as $55. California is an outlier. California, the cost of doing a background check on a private transfer of a gun is $20, but that's not the true cost. There's a price control there that the gun dealers are not allowed to charge more than $20. Their true cost is probably something around $70. But if they refuse to do that, even though they're losing $50 on each transfer that they do there, they will lose their license and not be allowed to sell guns in California. Just a way California tries to make it costly to be a gun dealer in the state. And so the problem that you have is that this type of tax may not stop you or I from being able to go and buy a gun. But if you have to pay $100 just for the background check, the very people that I talked about before who benefit the most, the people who are most likely victims of violent crime, adding $100 to their ability to go and buy a gun to protect themselves and their families may make the difference between whether or not they're legally able to obtain a gun. I'll just give you one quick example. You look at Washington, D.C. and many of these other states, the background check is on each gun, not on the transfer. So let's say you and I lived in Washington, D.C., and I was going to go and give you 4 guns. I'd have to pay $500 to do it. But it's just you. It's just one person. What sense does that make to have to do a separate background check on each gun that's transferred rather than just on the person who's obtaining the gun that's there? It's just an example of how they go out of their way just to make it costly for people to be able to go and buy guns.
Last 2 questions. How do we get guns out of the hands of the criminals?
I think it's not rocket science. You know, people talk about all the murders and stuff that occur in Chicago. Okay, well, there's a simple reason for that. You know, 2 years ago, only about 13% of murders in Chicago resulted in an arrest. Okay, nationwide, it's over 70%. You know, if you're not going to arrest people for going and commit, and the rate for gang murder is even lower than it is for the average there. And they don't even prosecute all of them successfully for the ones that they catch. So you're talking about gang murderers someplace in the single-digit range 2 years ago were being convicted for murder.
Over 90% are getting away with it. Right.
So it's not rocket science. It's gone up a little bit last year. They had a 20% arrest rate, but it's gone down again, I'm sure, this year. And, you know, it's not rocket science. If you don't arrest people, if you don't convict them, if you don't punish them, if you don't make it risky for them going and committing these murders, guess what? You're going to have a lot more murders. And it's simple when you look at Chicago, you know, what they've done to make sure that happens. All sorts of politically correct things. I can give you a couple examples. Under Rock, and it wasn't always that way. When Mayor Daley, the second Mayor Daley, took over, the arrest rate for murders in Chicago was 67%. When Rahm Emanuel came into office at the end of Daley's term there, it was down to 30%. When Rahm Emanuel left office, it was down to 20% of murders resulting in an arrest. And for example, for Rahm Emanuel, one of the things that he did was he made an agreement with the ACLU that every time a police officer talks to somebody, they have to fill out 2 legal-sized pages of forms with small little, you know, indents in there that explains who they talk to, why they talk to them, what they talk to them about, how long they talk to them, in excruciating detail there. And it takes something between 45 minutes and an hour or so to go and fill out those forms. So if you're a police officer and you go and talk to 4 people in the morning, your afternoon is basically taken up with paperwork dealing with the people that you talk to. When Rahm Emanuel became mayor, one of the first things he did was he closed down the gang units. Well, guess what? If you don't have the gang units there, you're going to have a lot more gang shootings that are going to be there. He closed down the police bureaus in the highest murder rates parts of the city and transferred police to kind of the Gold Coast and other areas that were there. If you want to reduce crime, you want to put police in the high crime areas. That's the way you go about doing it. And I mean, that's just
apparently Black lives don't matter in Chicago.
Right. I mean, who do they think are the victims? Not only generally of murder, but of these riots. These riots where they've ordered police to stand down, where they made it so the police can't go and deal with it. These riots are occurring in relatively heavily Black areas. Many of the businesses there are owned by Blacks. The people who tend to be employed there are Blacks. The people who tend to shop in those stores are overwhelmingly Blacks. Who do they think is hurt by all this violence that's there, all this destruction?
Take any poll of law-abiding Black citizens, they'll say they want more police, not less.
Right.
Last question, kind of hot subject these days, is militias, private militias, and them having guns and being mobilized to some small extent, at least so far, to stop some of these rioters and looters. How do you feel about these militias when it comes to gun rights and their use of it?
Well, I mean, I don't know how much they're organized or what have you. I mean, obviously you had the situation in Kenosha where this Kyle Rittenhouse involved. Here you had a kid who basically had put up Facebook groups and others to try to go and support police. He wanted to become a police officer himself. I think the media has been very irresponsible in calling him a white racist many times on CNN and other places, apparently. And, would I advise a 17-year-old to go and get involved in that? No, I wouldn't advise a 17-year-old.
But you think that militias play a potentially important role in law enforcement in America?
No, I mean, what I think happens, and something that you brought up yourself earlier in the discussion about Beverly Hills and what have you, having people be able to go and protect property with guns. You go back to the Rodney King riots that you have, the pictures of the Korean shop owners that had guns in order to protect their property. I don't know if I would have called them militia there, but you had private individuals trying to protect property. When you had the Ferguson riots, you had private individuals, not necessarily even the ones that owned the stores in Ferguson, coming out and trying to protect some of the stores that were in their neighborhood. I assume they weren't organized militias. They were just people who were concerned about the violence in their city and wanted to make sure that the stores and other places that they went and frequented weren't destroyed that were there. I have no problem with that, with people going and doing that. If they're racist, if they're people who are doing things for bad reasons, if they go and commit crimes themselves, if they go and commit violence, they need to be punished. And those need to be under control. But if I have people who, I have a store that I would normally go to, and I'm worried about it being looted and destroyed and it not being there in the near future, then I can understand somebody going there in order to try to protect that type of thing there.
Well, the police proved in Los Angeles that they were incapable of protecting businesses in Santa Monica and in Beverly Hills and in other parts of Los Angeles. They weren't capable of protecting business.
Sure. I mean, I spent a good portion of my life in Los Angeles. I went to UCLA as an undergraduate and a graduate student. I taught at UCLA Business School. I was there when they had the riots that kind of pretty much wiped out Westwood area. And, it'd be great if the police were there all the time to protect people. Unfortunately, police many times have their hands tied in terms of what they can do. And also there's just so much going on. We have over 600,000 police in the United States for a country that's 330 million people. It's simply impossible, no matter how great the police are, for them to be there all the time to protect everybody.
How does that stand on a per capita basis, by the way, compared to European countries?
I don't have that memorized right off
Mhm.
the top of my head.
I know Los Angeles per capita, we are very low when you compare us to New
Yeah.
York.
Well, New York, yeah, no, New York, at least traditionally, that's starting to change. But New York has had one of the highest rates of police officers per capita in the country, and that was basically Giuliani getting in there. He changed not only the number of officers, but he changed the hiring requirements, making them much stricter, and increased the training for the officers that were there. And that's one reason why you saw the huge drop in violent crime in New York when he had that big increase in police officers.
Thank you again to Dr. John Lott. You can check out his book, More Guns, Less Crime, on Amazon, as well as a bunch of other books that he has written on the subject. He's a true expert on guns in America. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you to our intern, Jake Wall. Happy Election Day, everyone. Let's hope it is a peaceful one tomorrow. Thank you for following The Hidden Truth Show. We'll be back soon with another episode.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.